Welcome back to Season 1, Episode 49 of the 706 podcast. Let's go around. We'll introduce ourselves. I'm the host today, Anthony, and we are...
Tony.
My name is Kurt.
And I am Connor. Nice to see everybody.
All right, so today we're discussing 2012's Cosmopolis, directed by David Cronenberg, based on Don DeLeo's novel, I think from 2002. The movie sort of takes almost verbatim the dialogue from that book, but it's essentially a story about this sort of rich one-percenter, young kind of tech billionaire, or wealth beyond, our wildest imagination, and his sort of ride throughout this day in New York as a sort of Occupy-type protest is going on along the way as he tries to sort of get a haircut. It's kind of the general conceit of the movie, but it's essentially a movie and a novel about ideas. It's, it's less so a sort of story, less so a sort of plot. Connor, I think you'd seen this movie before, but so I'm going to actually save you for last, I think. Tony and Kirk, you hadn't seen this movie at all, right?
No.
All right. So we'll start with Tony then, since he seems the most prepared at the moment.
Well, I would have taken notes regardless. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm prepared. Actually, yeah, it's funny. This movie, the movie it reminded me the most of was The Counselor. You guys seen The Counselor?
The Ridley Scott.
Yeah, it's a Ridley Scott movie.
Yeah.
So when it came out, it was very hyped, like when the trailer was because it had this amazing cast and it was directed by Ridley Scott. It was written by Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy's first screenplay of all time. Then it came out and it utterly baffled people because it was so weird. And Cormac McCarthy basically wrote the screenplay the way you would write a book. And that's kind of how this movie felt to me in the terms of the dialogue. My exposure to Don DeLillo is limited to White Noise, which I do like a lot. And I definitely could recognize the rhythms of his dialogue and characters kind of talking very quickly, almost past each other in these very kind of getting into these very conceptual, almost intellectual discussions that are very absurd, kind of this dry comedy throughout. The refrain of "my prostate is asymmetrical," it kind of keeps coming up, and it is pretty funny, almost in a Coen Brothers way, but it feels very weird. It's a very literary feeling movie. It feels very adapted from a book. I have a hard time imagining David Cronenberg creating this movie from whole cloth as an original vision. It seems very indebted to the book, even though I haven't read it. But as you said, it is a movie about ideas. In that sense, it reminded me a little bit of the last movie we did, Spring Breakers, and that these characters aren't really characters. They're not very fleshed out. They're not very three-dimensional. They're more kind of mouthpieces for these speeches. They're more people they're fonts for this dialogue, and they seem more symbolic than they are substantive, basically. And that's something that I think you're either going to vibe with or you're not. And I was sort of kept a foot away by this movie, which I know is part of the point. It's supposed to be cold. I'm sure most of the reviews at the time called it cold. That was probably the most common word used. And you're presented with these basically gleaming surfaces throughout really the first half of the movie, these very sleek, nice external appearances. And then as we progress through the movie and get closer and closer to the end, we enter these more kind of squalid environments. Things start to kind of break down. Society kind of starts to break down. But I don't know. I mean, that's the thing is the movie, I'm almost lost for words here because the movie, I felt like I didn't quite, it never got me. Definitely never get me on the visceral level. I was definitely never excited or thrilled by this movie. There were times when I kind of chuckled. There were times when I nodded my head and said, oh, that's interesting. I liked a lot of the lines. I thought a lot of the lines were clever or interesting. I liked Money Has Lost Its Narrative Quality, which felt like a bit of a statement of purpose here, like the search for kind of trying to find a narrative or commenting on things as though they're narratives, like the self-immolating protester and then him saying, oh, that's so boring. Oh, it's been done before, all that stuff. That's the kind of thing I usually get into. But by the end, when we meet Paul Giamatti, our kind of hidden antagonist, the movie had more or less lost me completely. This is the point of the movie where I should be getting more excited. Things should be getting more tense. I should be really freaking out or wondering where it's going to go. But once our lead, Robert Pattinson's character, kind of goes full Patrick Bateman, I feel as though I've lost the thread a little bit. I kind of feel as though it didn't feel to me like a natural, inevitable progression. It felt more like, okay, this has to go. This is where this has to go. We have to have this kind of crazy, violent conclusion. And I don't know. I just feel like I didn't quite grasp what the movie was saying. I didn't quite grasp why it was so alienating and cold. Yeah, I couldn't quite vibe with it. Maybe it was my mood, but because I liked other things like this, but it didn't do it for me.
Interesting. All right, so we'll move on to Kirk. Kirk, I think on the surface, at least, I would assume that this movie may also leave you similarly kind of alienated, or that you wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards this type of movie. Is that sort of true, or is it wrong? How do you feel about it? It's always hard to predict with you.
Right. And perhaps I'll list, an hour's worth of grievances and then vote it in. So you never know. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about this movie. I think, rounding back, like my summarizing thought is that I feel like it would work better as a play. I think this kind of format, this dialogic format, I don't know how to describe it, but it's very distinct. It's like, people are saying like, I think I'll go to the barber. Yeah, you will. When was the last time you were there? When wasn't I there? It's gonna rain next February. I think I'm dead. And it's like that kind of stuff, it gets a little grating at times because the author, the screenwriter, the character is asking for your ability to kind of flesh out and kind of formulate these subtexts throughout all this dialogue. So you're having like a conversation with yourself while you're trying to ingest the plot or the story that's being presented. It's almost like this author took a little too much of mom's vase in the morning, took a few too many hits, and started kind of writing extemporaneously about the indelible nature of man and our frailty and egoistic desires. And it almost tries to do so much and in the end accomplishes very little. But I think, like I said, this would have worked better for me as a play because I think it would have done well to be almost a one-scener, like, what was that, Sunset Limited, or I forget that one with Samuel L. Jackson and the other guy.
Tommy Lee Jones.
There we go.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
I think if it would have been confined to the limo, maybe like a certain palpable tension would have been able to kind of ferment for me. But when, towards the end, when it kind of, in the beginning, he only leaves the car to eat. And then he starts leaving the car to fuck, and then he starts leaving the car to kill, and then, so it kind of gets a little more disparate and convoluted. But I feel like some of these ideas are very intriguing. The idea of like, I found the most interesting one to be from his chief theory officer about the idea how what is it? Time.
Money used to create time. Now time creates.
Not time creates money, or yeah, no, money. Time created money. Now money creates time. Yeah, money creates our future almost now, whereas it used to like create our present. And I thought that was quite interesting and provocative. But it's this pitter patter, this continued oscillation between like provocation and obfuscation, like these kind of one-liners, monotonous one-liners that can be taken like 6 different ways. And I guess maybe it's a fault of my own, how I ingest media, that I find it difficult to kind of move on to the next one without fully, there's a lot of pausing for me in this movie, and maybe I would have done better in a theater. But that's why I say in a play, it's almost like I know I'm going to miss a lot, but that the human energy, that's, that kind of ephemeral energy there, is the temporality of it allows for those mistakes to occur. And to me, it's almost like we're reifying a sandcastle on the beach here in, gold-plated nonsense. Like it's meant to be washed away by the sea, some of these interactions with the characters. But I thought it was interesting. For me, the movie makes sense as all occurring in his head in some sort, or not even his head, someone else's head, whomever, the security guard being kind of his ego defense. And you could go on down the line, to kind of draw comparisons and flesh out the metaphor, but the limo being like his inner sanctum, his self-concept, right? And, it was interesting. Wasn't enjoyable to watch, really. I mean, Robert Pattinson did as much as he could, but I think this is like what I would classify as like high cinema, right? Like this wasn't really meant. I don't feel like there was an entertainment value. It wasn't really given much thought when it was created. Like, is this entertaining, enjoyable at all to watch, or are we just going to make a statement? And so that doesn't necessarily align with my priorities as a consumer of movies, but it can under certain circumstances. And lacking that human drama, that palpable sexual tension that was there and then receded and then came back, I think it's just falls a little short on multiple levels. But that's what I got.
All right, interesting. Good thoughts, Kirk. So Connor, you were, I think, more excited than even I was when I was pitching this last week, or whenever we did it. So are you similarly excited still? Do you still like the movie? How did it hold up in the second sort of rewatch for you?
I would say yes. I mean, it wasn't quite the experience I had the first time, which is where I was just simply impressed by kind of the novelty of it, the sort of restrainedness of it, the writerly dialogue, which I agree with Kirk and with Tony, or I think Kirk said it, that it's irksome, especially at the beginning. There's, when characters are talking, as a writer would muse, it can be very irksome. You have to kind of get used to it. And I found that was the case. Certainly I was off put for the very first time I watched it, but then, I was kind of under the spell of the language and kind of just the pace of these conversations. And that was the case here too, of this watch through. As I got more into it, as more characters appeared, the sort of expectations sort of fall away, and you're just along for this ride. It's a very casual ride, and I think the big question is, why did Cronenberg choose this book, or is there any way in which the movie itself and its subject matter has anything to say, or is any way of kind of dialoguing with or interfacing with the style, in which the movie is shot, which is in this kind of, I would agree with Kirk, a kind of stagey way. I mean, maybe that's a factor of the dialogue. Maybe there's only a certain amount of ways you could have done it without altering the dialogue. But I find that a really interesting question. I think there is something there. I don't want to get to it right now. But I did find it. I found it cold, as Tony said. I found it rather inaccessible. Maybe my brain was not firing in the right direction. I was kind of ready as I was watching again. Okay, this time I'm going to crack it open. It's going to make a lot of sense. I'm going to understand. There are all of these wise sayings and interesting observations were being dropped. I'm going to be able to understand what all of these are adding up to. And the only things that I feel like I really understand about the movie are quite obvious. Particularly on the level of like a political critique, the only things I can take away seem very obvious to me. And I know I don't think I'm getting it on a full level, but obviously that was kind of what I was interested in sort of revisiting. But again, I'm not sure how much more I got out of it this time. However, I still enjoyed, I loved the dynamic of, as the limo gets dirtier, as the clothes keep coming off, I don't know, that feeling of slowly taking, like items of clothing off, slowly becoming more naked as the day rolls on, and finally just following the limo to the very end of the line, where the limo has to go back in the garage. There's something about that, this compelling nature of just staying in the limo until it absolutely has to go back in the garage, of just this burnout, just this following something down, down to the very end. There's a feeling there. And I think the pace and the style of the movie kind of is conducive to that. And I think that's probably how the novel, I imagine, would feel, or that's how a lot of novels feel. There's a satisfied exhaustion, by the end of a novel. Right. And so I liked it, but I think, I'm not saying I get it totally, or like I'm totally like into it. I think it's a little cool and aloof, and it's a little pretentious in a way, but I liked it.
All right, interesting. I think all three of you are making points that are fair, spot on, and true for the most part. I think this is a movie with its own sort of didactic quality, it's either going to work for you or not. And, and you're going to kind of, I think, know that fairly early on. I think one of the reasons I like it is it's a sort of early attempt. The novel comes out in 2002. The movie comes out in 2012. Sort of early attempt to wrestle with sort of large philosophical questions that we're only now really seeming to get to, and we're only seemingly asking ourselves at the present state of discourse. But I think the movie itself, I think one thing that has fascinated me about it is it's not so much a movie in itself, and I find that very purposeful to the actual structure of what it wants to argue. I think Tony brought up American Psycho, and he brought up Spring Breakers again, which we did last time. I think American Psycho is a very early kind of look at the sort of idea of how much sort of vanity, this sort of vanity culture, can influence us to moral ends in an immoral world. And I think Spring Breakers is sort of offering us a sense of, if all we have is the proliferation of image, all we then do is money and continuously preserving a sense of image is what we were kind of getting at last time. But this movie itself seems to want to offer us is that in a world where money itself is out of our hands, we have no room for narrative and we have no room for personality. For so long we've been tied to that once it's gone, who are we? And it's actually most obvious in the rich, who are basically inhuman by the end of it. I think one of my favorite parts is in the beginning when he's talking about how, he's so wealthy, he could literally bring down countries based on how he invests his money in currency, which never stops, never ends, that kind of builds and builds until a country kind of dissolves and falls apart. But when he realizes that there's potential for him to go broke, what is he? A series of questions and a series of sort of empty, hollow statements. And he has no room to go from this. He's a sort of new rich character who has no idea how to invent himself outside of that. For the old rich, too, the idea of how wealth is circulating that's out of their hands, they have nothing but vanity and nothing but the sort of superficial culture of being in the bookshop, redecorating the lake house, redecorating themselves to go to a play, to a movie, to whatever piece of entertainment there is. And it's actually a really pessimistic and sad view, because I think the movie wants to sort of argue, and it takes us from the book, is that in our own way, the sort of working class and the sort of Occupy Wall Street-esque movement has actually adopted that. How do we get outside of that, and how do we think of the sort of world and visions of the future that don't inherently depend on this sort of idea of money? Because money is so far out of our hands now. It's only computerized. It's all advanced. It's almost accelerationist in this sort of particular world. So that's kind of like my ideas. I think I agree with you, Connor. I don't think I understand this movie. I think there's a lot of interesting, huge questions that even the movie itself doesn't quite get at, though it posits answers.
It's very helpful. Yeah.
It posits answers, and I do agree on a sort of movie level, like Kirk was saying, and I think Tony was saying this too, is by the end, that discussion itself feels unsatisfying, but I think it has to ask us is, why does it feel unsatisfying? And why would we want a sort of, climax there? On one hand, it's a sort of selfish reason. It's, that's just how I want art to be. That's how I want the movies I watch to sort of end. But instead, it kind of gives us this almost Brechtian sort of moment of, dissatisfaction. And why is it dissatisfying, I think, is kind of a crucial point. But I don't know. It's sort of a movie that I kind of self-reflexively think about quite a lot. And it kind of puts a question, I think, about how we consume art, how we enjoy it. I don't know if that's necessarily satisfying. And I think if you approach things the way Kirk is, which is totally justified, the movie itself feels incomplete and maybe, falls apart in aspects.
I think that you dislodged a lot, Anthony. You're very good at kind of queuing these things up and like posing these questions and like getting me to at least me to think that these movies in like a different way. But I think that this is in the proud 706 tradition, perhaps with cachet and I don't know. I'm sure a lot of other ones where it's a more fun movie to talk about than it is to watch. I think there's a lot of really interesting. I mean, there are a lot of interesting details in this movie. There really are, and I think it definitely is a movie of ideas. It's a movie that is full of ideas. It's full of little interesting moments. It's just the experience of watching it is not a particularly pleasurable one, which is sort of like, and I'm kind of agnostic on how important that is, but to most people it is important. To most people it's important. But I liked a lot of what you said, particularly the idea that the Occupy Wall Street people, the protesters, the whatever, the proletariat, however we want to characterize them in this movie, have adopted this framing. And is there any way to escape that framework. And the line that really resonated with that for me was when he says, towards the very end of the movie, when he's talking to Paul Giamatti, he said, "No one hates the rich. Everyone is a minute away from being rich, or so we thought." Or so we thought. The idea being that, like, because this was revealed to be a lie dramatically, basically, in the crash of 2008, but because we've believed it for so long, we can't shake that loose. Even as our lived experience, even as the world around us is telling us every day, no, that's not true, we've internalized that reality so deeply that it is kind of impossible for like a class consciousness to take root in America in like a deep way. I don't want to be that pessimistic and say it's truly impossible, but I'm saying that, like, in the near term, that is a serious roadblock, because that indoctrination or that cultural messaging or whatever, it runs so deep. It's we're told it our whole lives. One thing I liked also was just the idea of, like, and this comes out a lot in the conversation with the theory woman in his limo, the idea of, like, this stuff kind of runs itself now. We've created this elaborate infrastructure for running the world economy that's almost like doesn't even need human input. It's almost like this chaotic dragon we're just kind of ride and trying to kind of make sense of, but there's almost no way to. And even no matter how powerful any individual is, how much can he really do about any of it? And, you know, he's obviously is able to lose his fortune too. So it is sort of this, there is something kind of scary about it. And I liked that this character, the Robert Pattinson character, and Pattinson does a good job, but he's not really playing a character, so it's weird to even call it a good performance. I feel like it's almost like any competent actor could have turned in the same performance, I feel like. His character seems bereft of, like, ideology. Like, he doesn't seem to feel one way or the other about this stuff. Like, he's not mad at these people. He's not happy about it. He's not conflicted. He's just sort of, like, along for the ride, almost as if it has nothing to do with him, which I think is kind of a commentary in itself. It's like there's almost no room for the self in this world. There's almost no room for your subjective opinions. You can like it, you can dislike it, but global capitalism and these financial markets, they don't care. They don't care what you think about it. Like, they're just going to run regardless, you know? And I think there is something kind of frightening about that. And one last thing too, with Connor, you made me think of, like, what is the role, or what is the big thing tying this together here? I think that the limo is a human body that is getting old and decaying and dying over the course of the movie, and everything that happens in the limo is in his head. And that's why these conversations are so kind of inhuman, is because these are basically monologues a person's having with himself. These are thoughts you'd have in private. And your body's decaying, it's getting old, eventually goes in the ground. And his final confrontation with Paul Giamatti is basically his final judgment. And I thought you would save me. The final line, which baffled me initially, is now, like, as Anthony says, kind of a Brechtian gesture, basically us asking the movie, I thought you'd save me. I thought you'd explain this stuff. I thought you'd make it make sense. And of course, the movie, Don DeLillo and David Cronenberg are uninterested in doing that, or probably just incapable. So again, I think these things are in there, and the movie's opening up before me as we talk about it, but that doesn't change my retroactive, subjective viewing experience of it.
Yeah, and if I could kind of defend the ending, I mean, I think it's my favorite part in a way. I like, you know, the kind of, again, breathless, almost exhausted quality once we arrive at that point. I know it's a little cliche, right, that it's kind of the confrontation of the winner and the loser, now that the winner, you know, has nothing more to win, or somehow, you know, his winnings have been abnegated or whatever. But still, I found it an effective and moving thing. And I think there's subtext here. We don't have to read necessarily on a metaphorical level. You know, I think the subtext is, and as Paul Giamatti says, is that, you know, I think the Eric Packer character, our protagonist, is kind of craving his own destruction. You know, I think he does. You know, he's very passive about it. But that is sort of what he's after. You know, he has this kind of desire to die or to destroy himself, you know. That's constantly what he's doing throughout the movie. You know, it seems like it's just, which places, you know, it places a weird, I mean, like I said, he's not totally in control of whether he's destroyed or not. These things come from outside forces, but I think he goes along with it. I don't think he necessarily, right, he doesn't necessarily show a sense of justice, right? He doesn't see it as justice because it's a self-destruction, right? It's not necessarily a feeling of justice. And certainly that's why the ending is kind of thrilling in a way, right? I think our main character wants to be killed, right? In a way. But then why does he shoot himself in the hand and not in the head, right? I mean, there's questions about that, but I think that's basically what's going on. And that it's fascinating that the Paul Giamatti character, right, kind of represents maybe a sort of an intellectualized version of, you know, the people who would potentially, right, strike this guy down. And he's certainly not proletarian exactly, because he's sort of an ex-capitalist himself, right? But certainly he's completely dependent. It's a master-slave relationship, right, where he's completely dependent on Eric Packer for his entire identity, and his entire quest to kill him, right, completely defines him, such that he almost can't kill him, right, really, in the end, right? Or when he wanted to kill him, it was actually in an urge to somehow to be redeemed within, maybe this capitalist system or this system of values that he already subscribed to or something, right? So I think there's something kind of interesting about that. But
no, at the end, Paul Giamatti doesn't even, it's clear he doesn't want to kill him. Talk himself into it. He says, like, well, you deserve to die regardless. Basically, whether I want to kill you or not, you deserve to die, so I have to. And it's just like, once you've gotten to that point, it's like there's no turning back. So it's like sort of kind of rings false.
Kirk, were you going to say something?
Just in response to what Tony said about the idea of a body, the limo as a body, makes sense. Seeing that there's a lot of talk about where the limos are stored, right? To me, that's almost a dig at the idea that we bury the rich in more favorable locations than we allow the living to reside. The black limo driver has to drive back to New Jersey, where we have like Cavalry Cemetery, like, with Midtown views. But, I think this is a man who is bombarded, inundated with information, right? That's his trade, and it paralyzes him. And so he is paralyzed, and operationally he acts like a switchboard for these different ideas and these different perspectives throughout the movie, right? Like Tony said, it's kind of like a placid character. I mean, there's some definitely some dark undertones, but it isn't necessarily, doesn't require an extravagant performance. I think there is some homoerotic energy there for sure. Paul Giamatti even says, "I know you smoke cigars." I think that's an allusion to gay sex for sure. And this movie, to me, actually, aside from the limo being like a metaphor for his consciousness, I think the movie makes the most sense to me as taking place in Paul Giamatti's character's head. And the Pattinson character isn't real. It's actually just his kind of social conscience, like his social conditioning that he's reckoning with as he's trying to like navigate through this world. There's some really interesting things at the end. He's trying to interrogate all these maxims we've been kind of inculcated to throughout our lives, right? The idea that the rich prosper because they are naturally, better, innately better, the meritocracy. But you're right, he doesn't want to kill him at the end. He's reluctant to. And the thing that rang with me the most, and it's like in the last frame, you almost see a small tinge of a grin or a smirk on Pattinson's face, because he knows this, and the rich know this. The rich know that the poor can't, or the working class, whomever, can't go through with it. They're feckless. They don't have the organizing power nor the will to try to instigate any real meaningful substantive change outside of acts of performative resistance, right? And so that was really interesting to me. I also thought when he said, he's one of the more powerful lines in that last exchange was when Pattinson said, Paul was listing off all his grievances, all the things that the crimes against humanity, essentially. And Pattinson was saying, well, in order to justify killing him. And Robert was like, you don't give a shit about anybody else. And that's the thing, is he was espousing this narrative, this pessimism that we have in society that thinks of it as a zero-sum game, that Republicans, conservatives see Democrats talking about a living wage and they think, oh, it's just they want to accrue more capital for themselves, as opposed to trying to create an equitable framework for wellness and human dignity and valuing inherent worth, right? That was really telling to me. Is like he's saying, you're so self-righteous, right? But in the end, it's only kind of a smokescreen for you to get at my wealth, or for you to get what you couldn't get yourself, right? And I think that was definitely kind of emblematic of the counter narrative that goes throughout the movie. And yeah, there are plenty of great lines in this movie. It's really well written. I mean, obviously it's from a book, but I do have to say, just like mechanistically speaking, I don't think this was a masterpiece in cinema by any, or in filmmaking by any stretch of the imagination. I think something that really turned me off was the use of green screen outside the limo. It was so poorly done. It was so shoddy. I mean, it was like, this is 2012, not 1994. Like that scene with Jay Baruchel in the beginning, it was almost embarrassing how bad that looked. And I was like, what is going on here? This looks like a screen test or something. It was really weird. But
Kirk, the unreality, man.
No, I actually kind of agree with Connor, and Kirsten.
That's all I can say.
I thought that may have been on purpose. Like, it's a TV screen he's watching.
But then at other times, they actually were on location and outside. There were people and stuff. So yeah, I see what you mean. But and then also, just another scene that just was so obtuse was the Brother Fez scene. That just felt so out of nowhere and like tangential. And just like, who can explain or reconcile that with the rest of the film? I feel like I need a degree from Oxford.
Brother Fez is a known acronym in financial sectors for brother. Okay.
No, I think you threw out a lot, Kirk, but I like the switchboard metaphor, because I think you're onto something, which is sort of in the age of information, right? In the information age, how much information makes the individual, and at what point does the individual disappear and only the information sort of remain? Because I think what the movie's also sort of getting at, right, is when things are out of our hands, is you could assassinate the IMF president or leader, but the IMF is still operating. The idea of capital is still sort of flowing. That's why one of my favorite lines is in the opening, and I wish Pattinson sold this a little bit better, but it's, do people still shoot the president? Aren't there more stimulating targets? Which is so true, though, right? Because at the end of the day, then, if information is all that matters, then the individual's disappeared, and all that matters is the information itself, that the individual has no aspect to influencing or changing anything. It's the community that really needs to be centralized. And that's why I think also, and this is where I was thinking about Spring Breakers a little, one of my favorite moments is the pastry assassin, the guy who just runs up to people and smacks pies in their face, because he could get as close to the president, he could get close to Michael Jordan, but all he cares about is humiliating them. And what does humiliating do? What is the role of shame here? It does nothing other than attract paparazzi and, the image again. And I think that's kind of interesting there. And I was thinking through this whole time, though, how Kirk would take the geography of this movie, because I was really fascinated by it. And I was really fascinated by how wrong it could be at times. So I'm glad you brought up the green screen thing for you.
What do you mean? I mean, were you
well, I meant the window part
throughout Manhattan, and I couldn't really see like where they were.
No, not like tracking it, but I was thinking of like the green screen part, and then also like if you would complain how there was no geography to what they were like kind of doing. At least obvious to me.
Yeah.
No, I think Anthony and Kirk both alluded to this, and I do think my appreciation for that final sequence of the ending has grown. I think because I think what is so cynical about it, or what's so dark about that ending for both of these characters, is he goes to that place basically knowing he's going to die. He goes there because there's a man with a gun who's going to kill him. And Paul Giamatti wants to kill him, right? That's their understanding, is that Robert Pattinson's going to be shot by Paul Giamatti. But what they both have realized, to their horror, is that will make no difference. Robert Pattinson realizes, I could die, and with my literal, he says, tens of billions of dollars. Like, it's incomprehensible how much money that is. Like, that is a ludicrous amount of money. But like, even him dying won't do anything. And Paul Giamatti has the same realization. It's like, I could kill this guy, but like, what would it amount to? It would just be my own like petty vengeance. It wouldn't be any kind of self-righteous like revolutionary act. It wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't make any of this go away. So I do think that is like, and that also could be another reading of, I thought you would save me. I thought that you would give me purpose. I thought that you would give me a project, a program. And it's like, you realize that program was doomed to fail from the start, which I don't know if I agree with 100% of that, but it is definitely like a powerful and disquieting message.
I think one of the key moments too is when he's talking to his wife at the dinner, I think it is, and
Love the
he
wife.
brings up how he's losing all. he brings
really
up
like
how
the
he's
wife.
losing all that money, and how he's broke, like rich people broke or whatever, right? And she says she could save him. So even if he lost all his money, he's fine. He's totally fine. He's married, or at least he would be given money from his wife to one of the richest people in the world, right? One of the richest families, old money coming in to save him. That if you make wealth and you get to that position, you're good. That even like financial disaster is not going to affect you the way it would other people.
There's something about the wife, just her, obviously, the way she talks. I mean, she feels almost the most believable of all the characters for the way she talks. I mean, she is kind of an old stereotype that feels kind of outdated, of this kind of very much, sort of New England old money person, kind of preppy girl. But, and I can't remember, I'm having a really hard time remembering, the zingers, from the movie. But, her dialogue is just very funny, the kind of deadpan quality. And I in the detail that, right, she's a poet, right?
Yeah.
This is her occupation, right? So there's something I don't know, maybe it's a little personal, but there's some run-ins with people sort of like that. It's kind of real to me in my life in a way, kind of people who are poets but not really, or people who can afford to be poets, right? Anyway, it's sort of, again, an interesting commentary too, a little bit. I mean, it raises that question about the effectiveness of art, the fact that, right, all of this is sort of highfalutin, sort of pithy sayings and sort of clever turns of phrase of how to put these ideas. What does it amount to? Does it illuminate anything? Does it maybe it simply obfuscates, right? And also, what is the role of art in all of this? I know I'm getting a little bit, maybe over the top, but I think it's asking that question, especially, right, in the form of the pastry assassin, the cream artist, as he calls himself or something, who's creamed, so many important figures. Is this movie itself, just kind of a cream pie, in the face of anything,
Tony, cut that, Tony.
I'm bolding it. I'm underlining it. I'm putting it at the beginning and the end.
Obviously to ask that question, I found that interesting.
Real quickly, I think the pastry assassin, like, is the idea that, for this character, maybe for all of us, like, shame, public humiliation, being ostracized is almost more detrimental than death in our connected age. I don't know, something like that. I think along the lines of what he was going for. He's publicly humiliated. At least when you're that rich, right? Like or that powerful, when you have that much stature. And I think that is a clever device. The pastry assassin. That was pretty good. Of course, he had to be French. I think that guy was French.
He's so pleased with himself too. He's so proud of what he does. It's interesting that Pattinson gets more pissed about that than like his limo being trashed. You know what I mean? Like all the other things he endures throughout the movie, he doesn't even care. And then that is like what sets him off. But
it's probably the most emotional he is at any point in the movie, right? Like
when
there's
the
no other time.
rapper dies.
Oh yeah, the rapper, right? Which is sort of an interesting moment, right? It doesn't totally work. It's probably the weakest part of the movie, I think. But I think on one hand, right, it's partially this idea of course, music as potentially that thing that could connect us or drive us to something. And then, of course, seeing it turned into the spectacle through the sort of classic death of the young artist, the sort of Kurt Cobain factor. But of course, it's not the tragedy. Well, it's a tragedy in a natural sense, right? It's just the heart giving away to failure, that he's always had heart problems and it finally ends. And I don't think the movie necessarily does a lot with it, or even the book for that matter, from my memory. But
just to give it its due, it's like, this artist is a surrogate, liver, someone who has a spiritual life. Obviously he maybe gives a kind of false version of himself that Robert Pattinson is attracted to. He's probably supposed to be some like tough guy, but really he's not. But he's this deeply spiritual person anyway. So he's this kind of surrogate through which, Robert Pattinson can live a real human existence that he never really has because he's too busy processing information, and I don't know, there's something about that kind of hits home. I don't know,
The death of like soul and emotion.
Yeah, that artists, these rock star figures, right, are just kind of surrogates, right? They kind of live on our behalf in a way, you know.
It's interesting. I think, we could go around and give final thoughts in the vote in a second, but my final point, and it was when Connor was talking about the sort of nature of art in the movie and the way that the movie talks about the nature of art, is I was kind of thinking about this and the way Tony was talking about the coldness of the movie, or Kirk was talking about the sort of lack of fun, the kind of with the movie is, why are we so willing, I think, is my question. Why are we so willing to allow like a horror movie or a sort of genre piece to sort of unsettle us, to leave us cold, or to kind of, as we watch it, to leave us sort of unsettled? But in a moment of a movie of ideas, it's kind of all of a sudden burdensome. Is it merely because the sort of genre movies are giving us something sort of, stimulation, sort of relief? I don't know. But anyway, it's just on my mind. Sorry. Final thoughts.
Well, I think that for me, I mean, part of the difference is the medium. I mean, I think for me, film is a visceral thing on like a fundamental level, right? Like there are more cerebral movies, there are more intellectual movies that I like, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of the time, I want to like jump in my seat or laugh or cry or like have some kind of, I want it to register on that deeper level. Whereas if I'm reading a book, I mean, I like that too, but I'm more in the mind, I'm more in the intellectual space, and that's more what I look for. And that could just be me, but I think that I would posit that most people are like that. That's how most people watch movies. That's how most people read, etc. Or Kirk says, when you're watching a play, there are certain expectations you have. There are certain things you will tolerate or that you won't tolerate because it's a play, right? And maybe those distinctions are arbitrary, but they exist. They exist in the world and they exist in my mind, and I'm not going to pretend they don't. So while I enjoyed discussing this movie with you guys, I do think that this is a movie that was made to be discussed on podcasts, or more plausibly written about in Kahir Do Cinema fawningly, or not fawningly, but just like breaking it down, analyzing every frame. And while I admire its intellectual curiosity and its rigor, I guess, its commitment to its own inscrutability, this is not a movie I ever plan on watching again, and I can't vote for it in good conscience. So no.
All right, Kirk, as the richest, wealthiest, and most famous of all of us, did the movie end up working for you, or?
Go to Connor. I'm curious. I want to be the last one. Go to Connor.
All right.
Sure. Yeah. I had, like I said, I would give it a soft yes. I found that it, as we've talked about it, it reinforced my general impression that there's meat on the bones, right? There's certainly a lot to talk about it. I did not find it offensive on the personal level, though I definitely see why that could be the case. I can't deny that if I were to make this movie, I would have tried to filmify it a bit more, right? I probably wouldn't have been quite so. I would have tried to do something that Cronenberg clearly did not try to do. He had a reason for doing it. It doesn't really stand out. I think there's probably many better Cronenberg movies that we could bring to the table. But still, I think, I respect this movie. I think it's pretty cool. I understand that it's flawed in some way, definitely on the level of like, impact as a film, but I still think there's definitely merit there.
Yeah. I'm just, this always happens. I always I always find myself regressing to the mean, right? And kind of, but Tony is almost like my spiritual support right here. And I feel like I can lean on him a little bit as a compass in this situation, that it wasn't just me in terms of my viewing experience. And, I do agree with you, Anthony, that, perhaps things that make us uncomfortable outside of the normal social categories or, constraints, things that are a little more nuanced or taboo or unsettling in an intellectual way that kind of cause us to look inward can be less enjoyable. And, maybe that's enlightening in a way. But, I think if we had like an art podcast or like a piece, we were evaluating like ideas, collections of ideas, vignettes. I don't know. It just, as a feature length film, I don't think this is there for me. I gotta put my foot down, and usually I would vote yes here, but think. Oh fuck!
He's gonna say, he's gonna
oh,
say
no.
yes. How can he not? Oh, I can't believe it. No, that was a twist.
He's gonna say, but that's why this is the best movie I've seen in the past 5 years. And I'm like,
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard. Yeah.
I think it was fair enough. I think honestly, statistically, that this would be how it would break down. I think if we looked at all these film podcasts, if they did this movie, I think it's a movie that works for certain people more than others.
There's a Connor in everyone. Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think the ideas of the movie would appeal to people. I think the delivery of it is flawed, as Connor was saying, and could have been done differently. But I think the ideas were worth discussing, so I'm glad we did.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll move on to the favorite section, right, of selecting movies, which we'll get to in episode 51, after we take a break and deliver the live in-studio audience presentation next week. But yeah, let's go around and
Sure. Okay, guys, this is a big day. First time I'm going to re-recommend a movie that did not get picked. And it's an Anthony movie. This is 1949's Letter to Three Wives, Best Picture winner in that year. And again, about a bunch of wives who receive a letter telling them that one of their husbands has run off with another woman. Sort of a social commentary. It has humor, certainly, but it's pretty much an incisive kind of social commentary on the time, on sort of, gender norms, sure, we could say, of the time, expectations of marriage of the time, depicts very much dysfunctional, right, marital relationships. It has an unbelievable kind of character named Addie Ross. And I think it's just a fascinating movie. Obviously, it's kind of slept on, obviously billed as kind of a woman's picture, so to speak. But I think it's an important movie to go back and evaluate. I think when we think about movies, often we imagine, right, something so alien. I mean, this movie Cosmopolis, right, feels very alien to us in a way. But this is a movie that still, I think, feels very fresh, fresher than even movies from, say, the 70s. There's something actually very extremely, I think, contemporary about the norms that are being examined in this movie. Contemporary, for us in a way.
All right, interesting. So Connor dropped the renomination bomb, Tony. So are you going to throw in a Mishima or?
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like I should. I'm going back and forth between a few things. You know what? I'm feeling like, I know you and Connor have seen it, but I feel like I'm pitching First Reformed. First Reformed was my favorite movie of the 2010s. And it is a movie that I think about a lot, and I have a lot to say about it. And I'm really curious to get Kirk's take on it. I think it's a movie that's very ripe for discussion. And in contrast to, not to diss, this is probably bad politics here, dissing the host, dissing my voters here. It's a movie that has ideas, but it's also very it gets me very much in the gut. It gets me very much in my emotions and in my feelings. And I think it's a movie that has that kind of power I think it's a movie that is incredibly emotionally powerful and resonant and taps into some very real anxieties of our moments in a way that I would love to explore with you guys.
All right, Kirk.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm going to go. So I found out that my favorite winery, the owner of my favorite winery, also once upon a time directed movies. And she still does. And I bet you know who I'm talking about. What's that?
Are you the wife from Cosmopolis right now, Kirk?
I am.
The bougiest thing I ever heard you say.
Her name is Sophia Coppola. That was Connor actually thought I was being
I took the bait.
Let's just say real quick,
he's our neighbor. Yeah. So no, yeah. I know Sophia. Yeah. Absolutely.
Live down the hall from Jiho, down the street.
Yeah.
I used to drink her little pink bottles.
Yeah.
I know Anthony. I think Anthony's a fan. Anyways, I am going to nominate a movie that I watched right when I was starting to really get into movies as kind of a craft and look at the ideas more critically. I'm choosing a movie that kind of, I realized that was a catalyst for my realization that I really do enjoy movies on a deeper level than, say, watching Mark Wahlberg's Shooter or whatever. So this was kind of my foray into a more critical lens, and that's Virgin Suicides, 1999, Kirsten Dunst, unnamed Trump supporter. No, James Woods is in it, but we can forgive that, hopefully. But yeah, it's a great movie about notions of purity and adolescent sexuality. It's very, very provokes certain emotions within you, this eroticism mixed with sadness and guilt and weird sensations, and it's really well done and succinct, and I like it, and I think it's well acted as well.
Kirk, I'm just going to say in the editing, I'm going to chop out every other word to make that the worst sounding version of what you could have said.
Okay, well, there you go.
That was a very solid wind up, Kirk. Into I was getting really anticipated,
I was like, is he going to pitch The Godfather?
No, I think it's interesting. So Kirk and Connor throughout movies, sort of feminine crises, and Tony's the sort of spiritual angle. So I have a movie I'm leaning towards, but let's hear some rebuttals, see if I switch my mind.
I mean, this is just as likely to sway you to it. I'll say that I've come to decide more recently that I am not really a Sofia Coppola fan of like big directors. They have like a following and like a really strong style. She might be one of my least favorite. I've definitely liked some of her movies, but I'm not that into them in general. And Virgin Suicides is not my favorite. There are other ones I would rather do, but I don't know. I mean, there's definitely things to discuss. I feel like we would have a good discussion, but I think you could say that about all of these. Connor's is a little harder for me to trifle with because I know he's bringing the fire. I know he's got the goods. I know he's been sitting on it. I know he's got his notebook twice as thick with his treatise on A Letter to Three Wives. And I think we're all going to be a little bit like unprepared in comparison. But I'm sure it'll be great. I haven't seen it. I have seen Virgin Suicides, which is why I will say I'd rather do that one. But First Reformed, though, as far as its merits, I just think that, I don't know, I think a movie that's only going to become more relevant in the years to come. And I sincerely believe it's a movie that we have this fixation on the idea of relevance and the idea of is this old movie still relevant? People are still going to talk about it. Two people still talk about it. I think this is a movie that is going to resonate with people for the foreseeable future. And I think it is a movie that it was well reviewed, but almost didn't get the attention it deserved. I think it didn't, it connected with me on a deeper level than almost any movie I've ever seen. And I want to maybe unpack that a little bit, unpack its contradictions, maybe its problematic elements, or, what do we do with this? What do we do if we're this guy? What do we do in this world of ours? And I think that is an endlessly fascinating and deep rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah. And as for First Reformed, I've seen it and I didn't like it as much as I liked hearing Tony talk about it. Tony has a great First Reformed. I wouldn't want to watch it if I didn't get to hear Tony talk about it after. So I have a lot of respect for the movie, but like I said, through the lens, through the Tonian lens. Like I said, but I am really curious about Virgin Suicides because I've read the Wikipedia synopsis of the book. I was always interested in it. I'm curious about it. We've had the Beguiled, which we've discussed. Yeah, I didn't like her Beguiled as much as I liked the original. For example, I've seen Lost in Translation. I didn't love it that much. So yeah, I'm inclined to go for Virgin Suicide just because I'm very curious of all her movies. It's the one that I'd be most willing to revisit, I guess, or to visit for the first time. But First Reformed is also pretty cool. But, let me defend Letter to Three Wives. It's not too intellectual. It's very much accessible on a fun level. It's a fun, interesting movie to watch.
So I will say that, Connor, haven't we hit our Gene Crane quota? We just had one. We just had Send Her to Heaven. Leave Her to Heaven.
Heaven, yeah. Gene Crane.
She was the cousin. So
you doing some Googling there, Kirk, or did you know it off the dome?
I knew that off the dome,
Oh,
man.
of course.
Dude, I was DP on this film. 1946.
Watching.
That was right around the time I was fucking Ingrid Bergman at over at Paul Giamatti's house.
Good
Anyways, okay. Yeah, I don't know, guys. You know, it seems like Connor's got the lead here. Tony's movie seems, you know, these are all great movies, or I feel that way, I guess. I'd be fine watching all of them. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to disparage the other films, really. I haven't seen either of them, so can't really say too much. Maybe it'd be nice to. When was the last time we did a film in the 90s? I'll ask you that much. Have we done a 90s movie?
Never. Not once. Spice
Really?
World. That was it. No, I'm sure we've had a couple.
Topping
Yeah.
Spice World, Kirk. How could we go back?
Yeah. Well, so
New York.
good luck, Anthony. You know, no hard feelings.
All right. So here's the thing about Tony's film is, as I've said before, everything he said about Cosmopolis and his kind of discomfort, kind of alienation, unable to get into it is always how I felt and feel about Paul Schrader. I find his movies almost impossible for me to get into. And I always have a hard time getting myself to watch him at all. And I'm going to have a very hard time getting myself to rewatch First Reformed. I think, like Connor, I admire Tony's enthusiasm for it. And I could see something there. It's just not for me. And I don't think we need another movie like that necessarily. Could be interesting. I'll grant him that. But I can't do it. It's too soon for me. So I'm going to have to dismiss First Reformed. I think if Kirk would have put out Lost in Translation, I probably would have been an instant yes, because I think, like Tony, I've sort of softened on Sofia Coppola in general lately, but it's been years since I've seen some of her earlier work, and you know, so I think it's worth it. I think on the surface, Connor's movie is most for me. It seems like it's perfectly up my alley, but I think we got to go with Kirk here. I think we got to go back to the '90s. We got to explore something, and we got to see if we could rescue it from Tony's sort of dismissal. One of the things I'm going to pick it to is Tony is always very hard to persuade about coming of age movies. So I want to see if, you know, if we like it, if Tony will come around a little too.
Is that a fact?
I think, yeah, generally, like, coming of age movies don't do that much for me, because coming of age stories as depicted on film and like mass media often bear very little relationship to my own emotional, not even just the biographical details, but my own emotional reality at that time. I don't ever see myself in it. I don't ever really see myself represented in it. And I tend to feel alienated by it.
Okay, yeah.
See,
So
this
it'll
one,
be interesting.
no, I resonated with this. This movie resonated with me because, and we can talk about it next week or whenever. But yeah, that'll be good discussion. Thanks, Anthony.
What she's having.